There's a tendency for progressives to lay the blame for fascism at the feet of a couple of politicians or a political party. In the US, you've got Donald Trump, and in the UK, you've got Nigel Farage. The story goes that what's left that's good in our society will be stripped away by a few evil politicians, individuals, particular companies and their owners that we can just vote away, either at the ballot box or with our dollars. And sure, that can be immediately effective. It's also very shallow. Focusing everything around individual actors, Trump, Elon, their upbringing, their life story, ignores how the political movement that they figurehead is the real consequence of our current system. One of our current economic system's most effective weapons is what's called responsibilization. Responsibilization simply means society ascribes freedom and autonomy to individuals and agents as the thing that moves society. People have their ideas, they make individual rational choices based on those ideas. This is the tool by which center-left political parties, figures, elites, and academics have used to explain away what they see as the rise of a fascist movement. The book White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy, a book arguably representative of a lot of the views and perceptions held by Democrats, refreshingly holds rural white voters to account for their choices and for willfully gobbling down right-wing propaganda. It calls on rural Americans to take responsibility for themselves. This is deriving an understanding of fascism purely based on a set of ideas that have spawned into the heads of individuals who just need to be more personally responsible. This gives people like the Democrats an easy answer. You, as an individual, need to simply be more responsible. This emphasis on the individual and their ideas in their heads, however, is why a lot of progressives tend to incorrectly label Trumpism and MAGA and what threat they pose, and ultimately why they're largely ineffective at countering anti-democratic movements. Very quickly, the base of society, that being how things are produced, then dictates the superstructure or everything else from culture, the news, politics, etc. Think of the base as the canvas and the superstructure as the painting. At the base, you've got this fundamental dynamic or relationship, one between worker and owner. Nowadays, this relationship is a bit more blurred and complicated, but fundamentally, at a basic level, this is the relationship: someone who owns and someone who works. Both of these people want to make as much money as they can, in the easiest way they can, and in the best conditions, but they can't. Let's say we're in a cafe and the barista wants a pay raise above inflation and they want a break during the shift. That's going to cost the business and its owner more money. All else equal, at least in the short term, that cost will eat at the profit what the boss wants. These are two conflicting, contradictory desires, and it's at the heart of our economic system. Again, it's complicated, but you get the idea. Because the owner, the boss, owns and directs the business, owns and directs how and what things are made in society, they as a class ultimately have the power. This uneven relationship, one at the core of how we do things, from how we get food to people's mouths to how we transport people overseas, shapes how the rest of society functions. Now, because this relationship is ridden with conflict, the people at the bottom, workers, us, are less able to achieve their wants and desires, particularly because they're replaceable. The boss can just fire you and hire someone more willing. So workers formed unions, or they came together and said to the owner, "You'll give us what we want or we're out of here." It's much harder to replace 20 workers than one worker. This is called collective bargaining, and we've done this for better wages and conditions, and some unions even associated with political movements completely against and antagonistic towards this basic relationship. Fascism came about as a less than ideal reaction or counter to socialist anti-capitalist movements. Regardless of how you feel about these ideologies, the fact is that, at the time, they represented a break from the status quo. Society was faltering, people were becoming more and more disillusioned with their institutions, their political parties, their governments, and so they joined unions, parties, organizations that were explicitly against the status quo and were willing to fight it. For example, the Beno Rosso in Italy, where the Socialist Party grew to 200,000 members, the Anarcho-Syndicalist Union rose up to 500,000 members, and the General Confederation of Labour grew to 2 million members. To counter these direct challenges to their power and status, challenges that explicitly sought to eliminate such power dynamics, respective sections of respective ruling classes, reluctantly or not, began to back the fascists. Fascists were able to capture mass discontent by offering a different kind of collective identity, one based on one's nation instead of one's class. Instead of class struggle, they proposed class unity or corporatism under one collective nation. Of course, so long as the ruling class subordinated themselves to said nation, the fascist parties were more than happy to accommodate and preserve big corporations and profiteering. So that's what fascism was, a response to people becoming unhappy with society and acting upon it in a way which appeared revolutionary but also retains the base of the ruling class of said society. Every major political party, and honestly most unions these days, are committed to maintaining the profit motive, that being making things primarily to make as much money as they can, and committed to ensuring those who do make that money remain in power. Basically the economic base we just talked about. You may hear the word neoliberalism a lot, and what it is a state-centered hegemonic political project remaking capitalist production and social reproduction since the end of the long boom. Basically, the rate of profit, or how much money businesses were making, was falling in the 1970s, and so businesses, as is in their interest, wanted it to go back up. So through various ways, globalization, privatisation, deregulation, austerity, etc., governments intervened to make it easier for the owner class to make money, and a lot of it. At the same time, neoliberalism represented a suppression of unions, which meant workers weren't able to bargain for higher wages as good conditions, meaning there was less cost for the owner class on the labour side, meaning more money and, importantly, power. As a result, the remaking of capitalist production, making it easier to make money, has created an unprecedented amount of wealth inequality. In a bid to capitalize on the lack of unions, the workforce has increasingly become more casual and informal. All of this has created economic insecurity on a mass scale, something that has bred resentment, apathy, and disillusionment amongst large swaths of people. And this is a direct product of the economic system that we live in, a system ushered in by both progressive and conservative political parties globally. The ruling class can't have people, you and me, joining and participating in movements which challenge the base of society, because that's where they get their power from, their profit from. The base is how society produces things, and is where you work for your boss or your company to make products or sell services. They make revenue from that, they pay you a wage, and after expenses, they make a profit. Of course, as mentioned, governments are interested in making it easier and easier for companies to profiteer, widening that gap between you and them. The obvious problem with labeling Trump and MAGA fascists is that there's no likewise anti-capitalist threat. When they do gesture at it, the accusation of being a communist is lumped in with other scapegoats like DEI, immigration, trans people, etc. Socialist parties are minuscule, union membership is at all-time lows, strikes have barely ticked upwards and are at historical lows. However, mass disillusionment with existing institutions is there. Where contemporary fascist movements had to be collectivist and anti-free marketism to fill the role of socialist and anarchist politics, right-wing populists today are able to lean on much more individualism and neoclassical economics. Sure, Hitler privatized a bunch of shit, but the economy was still state-directed, directed in the pursuit of class unity under a single nation. That kind of corporatism simply isn't here today. Neoliberalism, as mentioned, not only has crushed any kind of collective organization like unions, but has suppressed collective identity itself as something valued by people. For this reason, I think the term inverted fascism best describes Trumpism. As put by Morris 2018, inverted American-style fascism differs from European fascism in one crucial way: the role of corporate power in politics of the state. Fascism movements in Europe seize the state apparatus in order to restructure society in the idealized image of their respective leaders. In doing so, all aspects of political and social life, including economics and business, became subordinate to the state. Inverted American-style fascism finds the power of capital overtaking and exploiting the state for its own ends. It's important to understand why fascism was a manifestation of the 20th century, because we can then understand where it comes from and its root causes. Likewise, distinguishing European fascism from American inverted fascism is important because they have two largely different origins and root causes. The elite today don't need fascism in the same way they did in the 1930s. Today, there is no significant threat to their power. This has allowed the elite to gobble up any kind of anger and angst towards existing institutions that exist and envelop it into movements they control. By blaming immigrants, queer people, wokeness, people have been duped into voting for and participating in political movements that they think are sticking it to the guy at the top, but in reality are solidifying their stranglehold on our society, or in the case of Trump, voting for the guy at the top. Right-wing populism rejects the progressive features of the dominant neoliberal ideology, i.e. progressive neoliberalism, while adopting reactionary attitudes. This ideology helps strengthen market fundamentalism. This was a conflict between two sections of the ruling and political elite. The more progressive, rainbow, woke side of it has fallen out of favour. It was ineffective at providing a placebo for people losing faith in institutions. Now the reactionary right-wing side of it has come and provided that effective scapegoat, that feeling of satisfaction as if the everyman has won. This level of analysis, where we recognise that society is moved by our environment, groups, classes, trends, populations, etc., as opposed to the ideas of individuals, is alien to what those progressive neoliberals, the Democrats, social democrat parties, believe. You'll have Democrats psychoanalyzing Trump, Elon Musk, saying they're fascist adjacent or fascist because they have similar vibes of nationalism and because Musk did a shitty rendition of the AWB Sieg Heil. They demonize Republican voters as individuals making morally bankrupt choices, holding bigoted and disgusting views that can be debunked and fact-checked away. And while the latter can be true on a personal level, I think it's ultimately unhelpful, shallow, and representative of how ill-conceived this way of thinking about politics is. That we can just vote in the right version, the competent managers of our economic system, then, everything will be fine. And don't get me wrong, lesser evil voting can have its utility, but that's not the argument. Electoralism is not just a be-all and end-all. Voting in the good guys won't cut it. It hasn't cut it. For all the good Obama and Biden policies you could rattle off, personalizing how we analyze politics, treating Trump as a crazy one-off deviation from the system is a fundamental mistake, potentially a fatal one. It's arguably a worse revelation that the people and organizations opposing Trump have this mindset. We have no collective strength. The ruling class doesn't feel threatened. Not only does this mean that there's no substantial resistance to the far right, but it means those progressives like the Democrats are pressured to churn further and further rightward, as that's where the pressure is coming from. If you're watching this and you identify with liberalism, free markets, privatisation, deregulation, all that stuff, I don't have to disagree with you on any of that stuff to show you that this system, the way in which you think things should be run, is self-defeating. Ceding more and more power and leeway to private companies, which has fueled inequality, will only spawn movements antithetical to your progressive values, like Trumpism. Focusing on the actions of individuals, standing Luigi Mangione, posting about how cool Ben & Jerry's are for a blog post, saying that if we just have the right guy then maybe the Dems would win, this is all worse than useless. It gives you the allure, the feeling that you're doing something radical or doing something that's going to change society, which by the way I'm ironically guilty of doing as well by making this video. But what I'm saying is that the fact that Trump and co aren't necessarily fascist is actually kind of bad news for us. It means that the ruling class feels so comfortable in its position that all it needs to do is throw out a couple of scraps to ensure and strengthen its position. And you can only get to that conclusion once you depersonalize, once you take a step back and look at the bigger picture. It may sound pedantic to clarify what specific ism Trump and that are characterized as, but it's a necessary step to identify root material causes, that being the consequences of neoliberalism, and that's necessary if we're going to look to any potential solutions or points of action.